On a frozen Tuesday morning, a homeless teenager reached into the mud beside a forgotten creek and pulled out a backpack that would change everything. Inside, a battered inhaler, a stuffed fox with one missing eye, and a name stitched into the collar of a small jacket that had been on every television screen since midnight. Marlo Cade, 8 years old, missing for 11 hours, and the daughter of the most feared biker president in the city. What happened next wasn't a rescue story. It wasn't a feel-good headline. It was something rawer, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone in power wanted you to see. Stay with me until the end of this one, because this story doesn't let go. If it hits you, hit that like button. Drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to know where you are tonight. This is The Weight of Marlo. The creek didn't have a name on any map Kalen Voss had ever seen, not that he'd ever had much reason to study maps. It ran behind the old salvage yard on the eastern edge of Duskfield, narrow and brown and unremarkable, choked with fallen branches and the slow accumulation of everything the city didn't want to acknowledge. In November, it ran cold enough to numb your fingers in 30 seconds. Kalen knew this because he checked it every morning, using the shallow water near the bank to wash his face before the shelter's morning line started, and the chance for privacy disappeared entirely. He was 17. He had been sleeping in the Duskfield Transitional Housing Shelter on Archer Street for 6 weeks, which made him one of the longer-term residents among the youth wing, which said everything you needed to know about the youth wing. Before Archer Street, there had been 3 months in his car, before the car got towed. Before the car, there had been his aunt's spare room in Millhaven, before his aunt decided her new boyfriend's comfort mattered more than her nephew's. Before that, there had been his mother's apartment, before the eviction, before the spiral that started the night his father didn't come home from the Kessler Road plant and never gave any of them a reason why. Kalen didn't think about the before chain much anymore. Thinking about it felt like pressing a bruise to see if it still hurt. It always still hurt. He found the backpack at 6:47 in the morning, wedged into the tangle of exposed roots where the creek bent sharply east beneath the collapsed section of the old chain-link fence. He almost missed it entirely. The nylon was dark olive green, the same color as the waterlogged leaves packed around it, and he only noticed it because one strap had caught on an upright root and the whole mass was shivering slightly in the current, alive in a way that dead things shouldn't be. He pulled it free with both hands. Mud sucked at it reluctantly. The weight surprised him, heavier than leaves and creek water should account for. He set it on the bank above the waterline and unzipped the main compartment with fingers that were already losing sensation at the tips, and the first thing he saw was the inhaler. A blue Ventolin, capped, still sealed in its original plastic wrapper. The kind a parent puts in a child's bag because the child is too young to track it reliably. The kind that meant something medical and serious, and not optional. Under the inhaler, a Ziploc bag containing 2 folded sheets of paper, drawings, he realized, crayon and marker, the kind a child makes when they're trying to communicate something they don't have adult words for yet. One depicted what looked like a dog. The other showed a house with a sun in the corner and 5 stick figures of descending height standing in a line, and the smallest figure had red scribbled hair. And under the drawings, pressed flat against the bottom of the main compartment, a small stuffed animal, a fox, orange and worn nearly smooth at the ears, one glass eye missing, a frayed red ribbon tied around its neck with a child's uneven bow. Sewn into the collar seam, in permanent marker on a strip of white fabric, was a name. Marlo. Kalen sat back on his heels in the mud and looked at the name for a long time. The creek moved around his boots. Cold air pressed through his jacket, a second-hand Carhartt that had been someone's better days before it became his every day. And his breath came out in thin white puffs that disappeared immediately into the gray morning light. He had a phone, a prepaid cracked screen, perpetually at 12% battery. He had seen the news alerts overnight without fully registering them. He hadn't been sleeping well, the shelter's heating system had been struggling, and he had developed the homeless person's habit of filtering alerts the way normal people filtered spam, scanning for immediate threat and discarding the rest. He pulled the phone out now and searched the name. The results came back in under 2 seconds. Amber Alert, Marlo Cade, 8, Duskfield. Missing since 7 p.m. Monday. The photograph used in every article was a school photo. Red hair, gap-toothed smile. Dark eyes with something bright and animal in them, the way 8-year-olds' eyes looked when they hadn't yet learned to make themselves smaller. The second result was a different photograph. This one from a news broadcast, the banner reading, "Father appeals for information." The man in the photograph was standing outside what looked like a garage or workshop, and he was large in the way that suggested it was permanent rather than cultivated, gray at the temples, a face that had been weathered by something more than just weather. He wore a leather cut over a dark shirt, and the patch on the chest read Steel Ravens MC, President. Kalen looked at the backpack. He looked at the phone. He looked at the creek and the drag marks he'd been too focused on the backpack to notice until now. 2 parallel lines in the bank mud, the width of a child's heels leading from the water's edge up toward the broken fence and the access road beyond. He thought about calling the police. He thought about the 3 times he'd interacted with the Duskfield Police Department in the past 18 months. The first time outside the Millhaven bus station, when Officer Parrish had told him to move along and then written him up for loitering when he moved along too slowly. The second time outside the shelter, when he'd reported that someone had taken his bag from the courtyard and the desk officer had handed him a pamphlet about personal responsibility. The third time, when he had been a witness to a fight outside the Shell station on Route 9 and had been detained for 4 hours while 3 different detectives asked him the same questions in 3 different tones that all communicated the same fundamental skepticism toward his existence. Kalen was not naive. He understood that the calculus of who got believed and who got processed was not random. He understood that a homeless 17-year-old showing up with a missing child's backpack was not a narrative that ended with gratitude. He looked at the news photo of Garrett Cade again. The Steel Ravens garage. The address was in the second paragraph of the article. 4400 Foundry Road, Duskfield. He re-zipped the backpack carefully. He put the strap over his shoulder and stood up, mud on his knees and ice water in his left boot, and he walked. Raven Forge Customs occupied a full city block on Foundry Road, a converted industrial space that had been a brake drum manufacturing plant in a previous life, and had retained the bones of that life even as it changed. The high ceiling with its exposed steel beams, the loading dock along the south wall, the wide concrete floors scarred by decades of machinery. What had changed was everything else. The shop floor now held a dozen bikes in various states of assembly, custom frames and rebuilt engines and paint jobs in progress, and the walls held the kind of organized chaos that lived-in workshop spaces accumulate over years, where every tool had a place and every place had a history. At 7:30 on Tuesday morning, it looked less like a garage and more like a military command center that happened to smell like motor oil and burnt coffee. Kalen counted 11 motorcycles in the parking lot as he approached, and at least 7 more along the street. Men moved between them and the building's entrance with the contained purposefulness of people who had been awake all night and were past the stage of feeling it. A folding table near the loading dock held county road maps, printed satellite imagery, a radio scanner, and 4 mugs that had been filled and forgotten. Someone had taped an enlarged copy of Marlowe's school photo to the wall beside the main bay door, and below it, in red marker on white paper, last seen, Voss Creek Trailhead. 7 p.m. Monday. Nobody stopped Kalen when he walked in. They looked at him. Some of them looked at him hard. The way people with threat assessment built into their muscle memory looked at an unknown variable. But nobody said stop, or who are you, or this is private property. He was a thin kid with a backpack and mud on his boots walking through their door, and in a room full of men who had learned to read weather before it arrived, something about the mud and the backpack and the expression on his face read as signal rather than noise. He stopped 10 feet inside the main bay. He didn't know which one was Garrett Cade, but he had looked at the photograph twice more on the walk over, and he had a good memory for faces. He found him near the back wall, bent over a table covered in maps, a younger man on one side speaking quietly, and a woman on the other with close-cut hair and the composed stillness of someone managing enormous emotion through controlled breathing. Garrett Cade in person was approximately what the photograph had suggested, and approximately nothing like it simultaneously. Photographs could capture scale. They could not capture the texture of it, the way grief lived differently in a body built for endurance, how it sat in the set of the jaw and the slight forward angle of the shoulders and the quality of the hands on the table, which were pressed flat against the map and absolutely still in a way that suggested the stillness was taking significant effort to maintain. Kalen walked toward him. The younger man, late 20s, sharp eyes, a scar intersecting his left eyebrow, saw him first and stepped sideways to intercept. "Son." His voice was low, not unkind, definitive. "This isn't a good time. I found something." Kalen kept his voice even. "In the creek, by the old salvage yard. Leave your name and number at the... It has her name on it." He unslung the backpack and held it out. The younger man looked at it. The woman with close-cut hair looked at it. And Garrett Cade, who had not turned from the map, went very still in a way that was different from the previous stillness. Not controlled stillness, but the specific frozen quality of a body that has received information so large it takes a fractional second to integrate it. He turned slowly. He looked at the backpack and the mud on it, and then at Kalen's face. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and took the backpack from Kalen's hands with the particular care of someone who understood that the object was simultaneously evidence and something more personal than evidence. And he unzipped it, and he looked inside. He looked at the inhaler. He looked at the drawings. He put his hand inside and touched the fox, and his fingers closed around it, and something shifted in the room that Kalen would not have been able to name. A change in atmospheric pressure, the kind that precedes weather. Garrick held the fox in both hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up and around the room, and what passed across his face in that moment was not grief and not anger and not fear exactly, though it contained all 3. It was the expression of a man who had suspected something and had now been handed the confirmation of the worst version. "She didn't wander," he said. His voice was quiet. Careful. The kind of quiet that costs something. "She didn't wander, and she didn't run." He looked at the fox. She would never leave him behind. The room understood him immediately. These were men who knew each other well enough to read between words. Kalen watched the knowledge pass through them like current through wire. The shift from missing child to taken child, and then every engine in the parking lot started. His name was Kalen, and he was nobody, and they treated him like someone, which was disorienting in a way he didn't have immediate language for. The woman with the close-cut hair was Juno Vance, the club's medic, he learned quickly, a former Army combat medic who had been with the Ravens for 6 years and who moved through the room with the efficient calm of someone whose primary skill set involved making critical decisions in degraded conditions. She sat him down on a stool near the parts counter, put a mug of coffee in his hands without asking if he wanted it, and said, "Start from the moment you approached the bank. Everything you noticed before you touched anything." She had a notebook. She wrote quickly, without looking down, which meant she was watching his face while he talked, which meant she was evaluating something beyond the factual content of his words. Kalen found this simultaneously uncomfortable and professionally reassuring. He told her everything. The strap caught on the root, the way the bag had been half submerged, the inhaler still in its wrapper, the drag marks. "Both heels," Juno said. "You're sure both?" Width was consistent, like someone was pulled backward while sitting, both feet dragging at the same time. Juno wrote something, circled it. "How old are you?" 17. "Where were you at 7 last night?" "Archer Street Shelter. There's a check-in at 6:30. She nodded, filed it away. "What were you doing at the creek at 6:40 in the morning?" "It's where I wash up, before the shelter line starts." She looked at him for a moment without writing anything. Not with pity. He was braced for pity, had developed a specific internal response to pity that involved going somewhat flat and remote, but with something more neutral than that. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a circumstance without the editorializing that usually accompanied it. "You want more coffee?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm okay." "You're not," she said, not unkindly. "But that's fine. Neither is anyone else in here." The younger man with the scar was Tomas Reeve, Sergeant-at-Arms, and he was doing 4 things simultaneously: monitoring the radio scanner, coordinating positions on the wall map with colored pushpins, fielding calls on 2 phones that seemed to take turns ringing, and maintaining a running quiet conversation with 2 other Ravens who came to him with information and left with direction. Kalen watched him work, and thought of the teachers he'd had who were worth something, the rare ones who understood that authority was most effective when it moved instead of standing still. The man beside Tomas was older, 60s maybe, with white hair pulled back and a hearing aid in his left ear, and hands that could have been a sculptor's or a mechanic's. Broad, scarred, certain. His patch read Wrench, road captain. He spoke rarely, and when he did, people adjusted their plans. Garrick Cade had taken the backpack to a separate table along the far wall and was going through its contents methodically, wearing gloves that someone had handed him, laying each item on a clean cloth. He worked with the focused deliberateness of someone who understood evidence and also with something else, something underneath the deliberateness that occasionally surfaced in the set of his jaw or the way his hands paused fractionally over the drawings before moving on. Kaylin watched him from across the room and thought about what it would feel like to have a child, to have something in the world that you had made and were responsible for and loved in the specific way that parents seem to love children, which from the outside always looked like terror arranged into devotion. He didn't have a framework for it. His father had loved him in the way that some men love things they couldn't quite hold, at distance, through gesture, with an awareness of inadequacy that occasionally broke into something genuine before contracting again. It hadn't been enough to stop the leaving. He realized Garrick was looking at him, not with suspicion, with something more complicated, evaluation and gratitude existing simultaneously, which was a facial combination Kaylin was not accustomed to receiving. "You walked here," Garrick said. It wasn't a question. He had seen the mud on Kaylin's boots, the pack, the absence of a vehicle outside that was clearly associated with the 17-year-old. 40 minutes, Kaylin said. From the creek. Yeah. Garrick was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you call it in? Kaylin held his gaze. I thought about it. Something shifted in Garrick's expression. He didn't press further, which was, Kaylin thought, its own kind of intelligence. Some men needed explanations. Others understood that the explanation was already present in the circumstance. All right, Garrick said. He turned back to the table. Then I need you to take us back there. Both. The creek in daylight, with 8 men in Juno and 2 heavy flashlights and proper evidence bags, told a different story than it had told to Kaylin alone in the early gray morning. Tomas found the sneaker first. White, Velcro closure, a child size 2, caught on a root 8 feet upstream from where Kaylin had found the backpack. It was waterlogged, and one side was scuffed with a dark abrasion that Juno looked at for a long time before bagging it without saying what she was thinking. Wrench found the construction dust. He went down on one knee on the bank, his bad knee from the sound he made doing it, and pressed 2 fingers into a pale, powdery residue coating the exposed root surface near the drag marks. He rubbed it between his fingers and looked at it in the light and said, without inflection, concrete form powder, specific kind, used in poured foundations. He looked up at Garrick. New construction. Riverfront, said a younger rider named Dax, who was 23 and had been with the Ravens for 18 months, and had spent 2 of those years before joining working construction. They're finishing the lower pilings on the Phase 2 build, Boundary District side. That dust gets everywhere. Tomas was already at the tire tracks, which began 30 feet from the water's edge where the access road materialized from the overgrown lot margin. He photographed them methodically, then crouched with his phone and pulled up a reference grid. He'd clearly done this before. Light commercial, he said. Clean tread, not a work vehicle. Something maintained. Multiple vehicles, Wrench said from further along the road. He pointed without drama. A second, partially overlapping set of tracks, wider wheelbase. 1 vehicle in, 2 out. Garrick stood at the edge of the bank with his arms at his sides and his hands open. An odd posture, something about it that suggested deliberate self-management, and looked at the configuration of evidence around him in silence. Kaylin, standing slightly apart, watched him perform the calculation. Marlowe's backpack placed deliberately in the water, not dropped, placed, in a location where the current would carry it or a witness would find it, either a result serving a purpose. Her shoe upstream, indicating direction of travel, was reversed at some point, or she was moved back along the bank before being taken to the vehicle. 2 vehicles. Planned. Coordinated. They wanted us to find this, Garrick said. His voice had no particular emotion in it. This was somehow more frightening than emotion would have been. Not all of it, but some of it. They wanted the search to go toward the creek. Away from the site, Juno said. Away from the site. The morning had gone cold in the way that late November mornings go cold once the thin initial sunlight fails. A wet cold, the kind that found gaps in clothing and settled in. Kalen's left boot was still damp from the morning, and he could feel the chill working up through his ankle. He said nothing about this. Around him, men who had been awake for 17 hours moved with the methodical focus of people for whom discomfort had become a background frequency long ago. They were heading back toward the vehicles when the black SUV appeared. It came down the access road from the north, moving slowly enough that it was clearly not passing through. It stopped at the edge of the lot, engine running, and sat there. Dark windows. No plates visible from this angle. It sat for approximately 40 seconds, and every one of the Ravens had clocked it within the first 10, in the particular way that groups of people with heightened situational awareness clock anomalies, not with dramatic reaction, but with the slight recalibration of body position that meant noted. Then it reversed, slowly, back the way it came. "That's the third time," said a Raven named Cole, who was broad and quiet and wore a red bandana folded at his wrist. He said it to Thomas rather than to the group. "Third time today?" Thomas asked. "Third time since midnight. Dax and I were on the Voss Creek perimeter at 2:30 and 4. Same vehicle, we think, or same model." Thomas looked at Garrick. Garrick was still watching the empty road where the SUV had been. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's go." Back at Raven Forge, the atmosphere had shifted in the hour they'd been gone. 2 more Ravens had arrived. Kalen counted 16 now, plus Juno, and the table maps had been supplemented with printed satellite images of the riverfront development site, sourced from somewhere that likely wasn't public GIS. A woman named Petra, who had introduced herself to Kalen as Wrench's daughter and handled what appeared to be the club's digital intelligence work, was running something on a laptop at the far end of the table that she minimized when Kalen walked past and maximized when he kept walking without stopping to look. He was not offended by this. He understood the logic of it. He was still a stranger here, regardless of what he had brought them. He sat in the corner with his coffee, which was now his third, and which was doing approximately nothing for the exhaustion that had been building since 5 a.m., and he watched the room work. There was something about watching competent people operate within a structure they'd built and understood that had always settled something in him. Not envy exactly, more like the particular ache of recognizing a thing you'd never had the opportunity to want concretely before. His mother had worked 2 jobs and loved him in an exhausted, fragmented way that he believed was genuine. His father had been present and then absent, and the interval between those states had lasted most of Kalen's conscious life. His aunt had been a circumstance rather than a choice. The shelter on Archer Street had a curfew and a duty of care and a case manager named Deb who remembered his name and checked on him when he missed morning meals and who was doing everything within a system that allocated her 47 other cases and approximately 0 additional resources. He was not unaware of how he had arrived at the creek at 6:47 that morning. He was not unaware that the arithmetic of his circumstances had been the determining factor in what happened after. He had no idea yet what any of it meant. Garrick came to stand near him without announcement, coffee in hand, looking not at Kalen but at the room, specifically at the wall map where Tomas was adding new markers. "You have somewhere to be today?" he asked. "School," Kalen said, because it was true, and because he'd learned that the truth, offered plainly, sometimes calibrated how people positioned themselves toward you more efficiently than any other approach. Garrick looked at him then. The school comment seemed to have landed somewhere specific, recalibrated something. "How long have you been at the shelter?" 6 weeks. "Before that?" "A while." He met Garrick's eyes. "I'm okay." Garrick nodded. Didn't push. "I need to ask you to stay," he said, "for now. You're the only one who's seen the scene before it was a scene. Juno's notes are good, but she's going to need to ask you more questions." "I know." "You don't have to." "I know that too." Garrick looked at him for another moment, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softening, exactly, but a slight opening, like a door that has always been slightly ajar becoming marginally more so. He said nothing further. He walked back to the map table. Kaylin watched him go and thought about what it meant that a man who was burning with fear for his child had taken the time, twice now, to make it clear that Kaylin's presence was requested rather than required. He thought about the fox in the backpack, and the name stitched into the collar, and the drawings in the Ziploc bag. The stick figure family, with the red-haired smallest one. He thought about what it would feel like to be 8 years old and cold and afraid, and knowing that somewhere out there, people who loved you were moving toward you even when they didn't know where you were. He hoped it felt like something. He hoped it felt like something more than he'd had to hold on to when he'd needed it. The radio scanner on the table crackled, and Tomas reached for it, and the room shifted attention, and Kaylin brought his coffee to his lips and tasted cold and bitterness and thought, stay, quotes. It was Petra who found the footage first. She had been working the Riverfront Development's public-facing contractor network, technically a gray area at minimum, but nobody in the room raised any objections when she laid her findings on the table at 10:43 that morning. The camera was an exterior unit mounted on the Phase 2 construction crane, installed by the site management company for insurance documentation purposes. Its official field of view covered the crane arm and the immediate staging area below. Its actual field of view, due to a mounting bracket installed at a non-standard angle, also covered approximately 200 feet of the access road leading toward the river, which nobody had apparently noticed or thought to note. Or perhaps someone had noticed and thought it might prove useful. The footage was from 7:14 p.m. Monday evening. Low resolution, the particular grainy quality of construction site security cameras that are purchased for compliance rather than capability. But clear enough. A white panel van moving slowly north on the access road, followed at a distance of approximately 40 meters by a black SUV. Petra had enhanced the van, enhanced it to the edge of what the resolution would tolerate, and on the van's rear panel, barely visible through compression artifacts, was the partial text of a company logo, 2 letters and a fragment, RV something, and below it a number, a partial plate. Thomas had the number working through 3 different channels before Petra finished presenting it, but it was the timestamp that mattered most, 7:14 p.m. Marlowe had been reported missing at 8:47 when Garrick returned home from a scheduled club meeting at Raven Forge to find the neighbor who'd been watching Marlowe sitting in his kitchen with the police, Marlowe gone and the back door open and a single small sneaker on the porch steps. The neighbor, Mrs. Aldrin, 63 years old, had heard nothing unusual until she heard everything. 7:14 p.m. They'd had her for 90 minutes before anyone knew to look. The room was very quiet. Garrick stood at the end of the table with both hands flat on the surface and looked at the still image of the white van on Petra's screen. Kaylin, standing near the wall, watched his face go through something that moved too quickly to follow. Not collapse, because Garrick Cade was not a man who collapsed, but a compression. The kind that happens when information that exists at the scale of horror has to be processed by a body that is still required to function. She was alive, Juno said. Not a question, a deliberate statement placed in the room to be held. The asthma protocol. If she's been in a cold, damp environment since last night, her triggers are elevated. She'll be frightened, which increases respiratory effort, but she's managed it before. She knows how to breathe through the early stages. She paused. She'll need the inhaler within 3 hours of onset, maybe 4 if she stays calm. She won't stay calm, Garrick said. His voice was steady. She's 8 years old, and she's in the dark, and she doesn't know where she is. No, Juno agreed. She won't. The number crunching was brutal in its simplicity. Current time, 10:47 a.m. Time of last known position, 7:14 p.m., 15 hours and 33 minutes ago. If Marlowe had begun experiencing respiratory distress at any point in the last several hours, which the combination of cold exposure, fear, physical exertion, and the absence of her inhaler made statistically likely, then the window available to them was compressing in real time. We go to the site, Garrick said. Tomas was already looking at him with the particular expression of a man who has identified an obstacle and is preparing to present it efficiently. We have two problems. Lehman? I know about Lehman. Detective Sergeant Brent Lehman, Duskfield PD, Major Crimes Division, had arrived at Raven Forge at 9:15 that morning with two uniformed officers and a demeanor that suggested he was less interested in coordinating a search and more interested in establishing jurisdictional primacy. He had spoken with Garrick for 11 minutes in the small office off the main bay, and Kalen, who had been in the adjacent parts room doing nothing in particular at nothing in particular's request, had heard exactly enough of the conversation to understand its shape. Lehman had access to the creek scene. Lehman had decided the tire tracks were consistent with routine access road use. Lehman had explained, in the tone of someone explaining something that should be self-evident, that the department was pursuing active leads and that the club's involvement in the search was not helpful and potentially legally problematic, and that Garrick's best course of action was to let professionals do their jobs. Garrick had let Lehman finish talking and then had said quietly that Lehman should close the door on his way out. Lehman had left two uniformed officers at the entrance to the Raven Forge parking lot. They were still there. They weren't preventing anyone from leaving. They couldn't, legally, but their presence functioned as message. He's not trying to find her, Wrench said. He was sitting on an overturned crate near the radio table, his bad knee extended, his expression carrying the flat certainty of someone who has lived long enough to identify corruption not by its markers, but by its smell. He's managing us. That's a significant accusation, Garrick said. I've been making significant accusations about Lehman for 4 years, Wrench said. I've been right 4 years running. The silence that followed was the kind that fills with things that can't be unsaid once they are, and nobody wanted to be the first to say them. Because once you say the police are not looking for your child, the police are looking for a way to contain the people looking for your child, you have entered a different kind of territory entirely, the kind where the rules are different and the footing is uncertain, and the decisions you make are not recoverable. Kalen, in his corner, said nothing. He was watching Garrick's face and thinking about a specific moment 4 months ago outside the Millhaven Social Services building when a caseworker named Henderson had explained to him that the county's transitional support program had a 12-week waiting list and that his situation, while unfortunate, was not categorized as acute, and that there were resources available, and had handed him a laminated card. And Kalen had taken the card and looked at it and thought, "There is no one coming." Not in the way the phrase usually meant, which was defeat. In the way that meant he was the only logistics he had access to, and he needed to start acting accordingly. He wondered if Garrick was arriving at the same understanding now, at a different scale, and with stakes that were almost incomprehensible by comparison. The difference between their situations was almost everything. The similarity was the moment of recognition. The radio crackled again. This time it was one of the two Ravens who had been doing quiet perimeter surveillance since 9, a man called Birch, who barely spoke, and when he did it mattered. Black SUV, parked on Stellar, facing south. They've got a line on the Foundry Road entrance. A pause. Two men, not cops, dressed like contractors, but they're not watching the building, they're watching the lot. Every head in the room went to Garrick. Garrick looked at the satellite image of the riverfront site. He looked at the still frame of the white van. He looked briefly at the stuffed fox on the table beside the evidence cloth. "How well do you know the storm drain network?" he said to Wrench. Wrench didn't answer immediately. He looked at Garrick with the expression of a man being asked something that he has spent years hoping nobody would ask, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was going to set something irreversible in motion. "Well enough," he said. Garrick nodded. He looked around the room, and the room looked back at him, and the understanding that moved between them was wordless and total, and carried the weight of everything they were all about to walk into. Then he looked at Kalen. "You don't have to be part of this next part," he said. Kalen held his gaze, and somewhere beneath the riverfront development site, in the cold dark of unfinished concrete tunnels that ran beneath the river mud, a small, exhausted child pressed a worn stuffed fox to her chest and tried very hard to breathe, and couldn't quite, and tried again. Kalen said, "I know." He meant it as confirmation. Garrick read it as something else, not agreement exactly, but a particular variety of quiet stubbornness that older men recognized in younger ones who had been left to solve their own problems long enough that collaboration had become a foreign language they could technically speak but didn't entirely trust. He looked at the boy for another moment, and then he nodded once and turned back to the room, and the decision was made without anyone having to say it. Kalen stayed. He told himself it was because of the drag marks, because he was the only one who had seen the scene untouched, before boots and evidence bags and the clinical language of organized search had layered over it. He told himself Juno might need to ask him more questions. He told himself these things while understanding, somewhere lower than the logic of it, that what he was actually doing was remaining in the only room he'd been in for 6 weeks, where no one had looked at him like he was a problem to be managed. He wasn't going to examine that too closely. Not right now. Wrench was on the phone in the small office. The door closed, not fully, and through the gap Kalen caught fragments. Access hatches, maintenance schedule, Phase 2 bypass, northwest quadrant. The voice on the other end was older and male and conveyed information with the practiced economy of someone who had spent decades describing things precisely because imprecision cost money or time, or worse. Wrench listened more than he spoke, which was consistent with everything Kalen had observed about him, and wrote on a notepad with a mechanical pencil and the compressed handwriting of someone who had once needed to fit a lot of information onto small surfaces. The radio on the main table crackled twice. Birch, short burst, position updates delivered in a private shorthand that the room decoded without visible effort. The black SUV on Stellar was still stationary. A second vehicle, possibly the same model, had been logged 2 blocks north on Greer. Not moving, not approaching. Present in the specific way that a threat is present when it wants you to know it's there without giving you grounds to act on knowing. Garrick stood at the satellite imagery and did not speak for 4 minutes. Kalen counted because he was in the habit of counting silence. It was information, the way duration and quality of silence was information, the way different silences meant different things from adults who controlled space with them. His father's silences had been guilty. His aunt's had been calculating. The shelter's silences at night had been the accumulated weight of other people's losses pressing through thin walls. Garrick's silence was architectural. It was a man building something. Tomas came to stand beside him, 2 coffees, offered one without comment, accepted the absence of comment in return. They looked at the satellite image together, and then Tomas said very quietly, "You know what this looks like." "I know what it looks like. It's not an amateur operation. The placement of the bag, deliberate misdirection. The SUV surveillance, professional. 2 vehicles for the extraction, clean plates. Someone with resources planned this, planned it carefully." "I know." "Then you know that means someone knew Marlowe's routine, her school schedule, that she'd be with Mrs. Aldrin on Monday. Someone was close enough to—" "Tomas." Garrick's voice was the same quiet it had been all morning. It stopped Tomas not through force, but through its particular quality. The quiet of a man at the absolute edge of his management, exerting the last of a finite resource. "I need 20 more minutes before I can have that conversation." Tomas was still for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," and stepped back and went to the radio. 20 minutes. Inside which someone had been close enough to plan an abduction with that kind of precision and that kind of resource. Close enough to know the inhaler protocol, which meant close enough to know about the asthma. Close enough to know what mattered to an 8-year-old girl and to use it. The fox left behind, not lost, placed. A signal or a message, or both. Kalen thought about the 20 minutes. He thought about what a man like Garrick Cade was doing with 20 minutes that he couldn't do in 19. He looked at the wall, at Marlowe's school photo, at the red marker beneath it, and he thought, someone inside. Then he put it away because it wasn't his to carry, and he had enough of his own. Juno appeared at his elbow with the notebook again. She sat on the adjacent stool, crossed one boot over her knee, and said, "I want to go back to the drag marks. You said the width was consistent with both heels dragging simultaneously." "Yeah. Not alternating, not the pattern you get if someone's being pulled by one arm while walking." "No, both at once, like dead weight." She wrote, "Age 8, approximate weight for her build, maybe 55 pounds. Moving dead weight 55 pounds across uneven bank mud, requires two hands and significant effort, or one very strong individual who's done it before. She didn't elaborate on done it before. She didn't need to. The drag marks ended at the access road? At the vegetation margin, then tire tracks started. No intermediate footprints? No indication she was standing at any point between the bank and the vehicle? Kalen thought about this carefully, the way he'd taught himself to think about things he'd observed, which was to rebuild the observation from its raw materials rather than from his interpretation of it. I didn't see any, but it was early, low light. I wasn't looking for footprints specifically. Juno nodded. That's honest. She made a note. The construction dust Wrench found on the route. Was it on both sides of the bank, or just the one? Just the west side, where the drag marks were. So whoever carried her crossed from west to east. She drew something in the margin of the notebook, not words, a quick sketch, a diagram of the bank and the route configuration. That means they came from the direction of the access road. They didn't come through the salvage yard on the east. Riverfront side, Kalen said. Riverfront side. She closed the notebook, but not in the way of someone who was finished, in the way of someone who needed both hands for the next thing. She looked at him directly. You want to tell me how long you've been doing that? Doing what? Observing detail like that. The specificity. You noticed the width of the drag marks. You noticed the dust was on one side. You noted the timestamp on your phone before you opened the bag. I saw you mention it earlier without being asked. That's not accidental. Kalen said nothing for a moment. I noticed things. How'd you develop that? He held her gaze. Being in situations where I needed to. She received this without comment, filed it. All right, she said. I'm going to need you closer to the planning table when Wrench comes back out. You may remember things about the approach geometry that we'd otherwise miss. He nodded. She stood, then paused, looked at him with the particular expression of someone weighing whether to say a thing and deciding slightly in favor. For what it's worth. What you did this morning, Volk, walking 40 minutes instead of handing it off, that took something. I just walked. People make choices before they walk, she said. And then she went to the radio table and left him with that, which he found, after turning it over a few times, he couldn't find a way to disagree with. Wrench came out of the office at 11:20 with the notepad and a hand-drawn map that took over the center of the planning table and reorganized everything around it. The Duskfield storm drain network had been laid in two separate phases, the original mid-century infrastructure running beneath the established grid, and the Phase 2 extension built alongside the riverfront development to manage runoff from the new construction. The extension wasn't yet on any public utility map. It had been approved as part of the development's environmental impact filing, which was public record but buried 6 levels deep in the county planning archive and essentially invisible unless you knew to look for it. Wrench knew to look for it because Wrench had spent 30 years knowing where the city's hidden bones were located, and why they were hidden, and who had paid to keep them that way. He didn't explain how he knew. Nobody asked. The Phase 2 drainage system ran in a network of interconnected tunnels from the river intake south and east beneath the development site, with maintenance access hatches placed at structural intervals, approximately every 150 feet. Several of those hatches opened inside the unfinished Phase 2 construction zone. The lowest level of the development, currently unoccupied and sealed from the public by temporary fencing, was accessible via the drain network from an entry point on the old salvage yard property, which abutted the eastern boundary of the riverfront site. Kalen looked at the map and located the creek, looked at the salvage yard boundary, looked at the Phase 2 zone. He understood immediately what he was looking at. The spatial logic of it clicked into place the way things clicked when you'd spent years learning to read environments that weren't designed for your benefit. That's why the backpack was placed at the creek, he said. Every head in the room turned. He pointed at the map without self-consciousness. If someone was moving her from here, he indicated the Phase 2 access, through the drain network to a vehicle staged here, the access road. They crossed the creek at this point. She lost the backpack in transit, or it was taken off her and placed. Either way, the geographic logic goes east to west from the development site outward. Wrench looked at him, then looked at Garrick. Garrick said, "Keep going." The tire track's running north. If the vehicle was staged at the access road and moved her north, the nearest route to the development site's interior that avoids the main riverfront entrance, which would have cameras even at night, runs through here. He traced a route on the map. Maintenance road. Service access. Not lit. The room was quiet in the way it had been quiet when Garrick identified the backpack placement as deliberate misdirection. The quality of attention shifting. "He's right," Wrench said. "Not to Kaylin, to the room." "The geometry fits." Thomas was already on his phone. "Petra, the Phase 2 maintenance access. North corner service road. I need anything you can find on gate logs, keycard access, contractor check-ins from the last 72 hours. Garrick was looking at Kaylin in the way he'd looked at him twice before, the complicated evaluation. But there was something new in it now. Something that Kaylin recognized from the few teachers who had been worth something. The particular attention of someone recalibrating their assessment upward. "You've done this before," Garrick said. "Figured out where I was," Kaylin said. "What I was in, what the exits looked like." A brief pause. "Yeah," Garrick said. "That's what I thought." He turned back to the map, and the room turned with him, and Kaylin understood that he had just crossed from the boy who found the backpack to something that didn't have a name yet, but was more integrated than that. He was not sure how he felt about this. He filed it away with the other things he wasn't examining right now. Petra found the anomaly at 11:47. She didn't announce it. She said, "Garrick," in a flat tone that communicated volume without employing it, and Garrick crossed to her laptop in 4 steps, and everyone else drifted after him with the organic synchrony of a group that had learned to move as a body. The Phase 2 development's contractor management system was cloud-based, accessible through a vendor portal that required a login Petra had obtained through means she didn't specify. The keycard access logs for the maintenance service entrance showed standard contractor activity during daylight hours Monday. A concrete crew, a utilities inspection team, a delivery of rebar documented in the invoice system. And then at 6:52 p.m. Monday evening, a single keycard swipe at the maintenance gate. Employee ID registered to a company called Riven Solutions LLC. No other log entries for that ID that day. No corresponding vehicle log. Riven Solutions, Tomas said. Petra was already running it. Private security contractor, incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago. No significant web presence. Staff directory not publicly available. She scrolled. But she pulled up a second tab, a corporate registration document. The registered agent was a law firm with a Duskfield address, and the firm was listed in 3 other incorporation documents on the same screen. Same registered agent as Northfield Property Holdings, which is the development entity behind the Riverfront Phase 2 project. The air in the room changed. "They're inside the development," Wrench said. "They are the development," Petra said, "or connected to it in a way that gives them interior access, private security authority, and a reason to be on site after hours that nobody would question." Garrick straightened slowly. He looked at the screen for a long time. When he spoke, it was very measured. "What is Northfield Property Holdings?" "It's a subsidiary." Petra scrolled again. "It traces back 3 layers through holding companies, but the ultimate parent is a private equity fund registered in the Caymans. I can't get to the beneficial owner without—" "Who sits on the Duskfield Riverfront Development Authority?" Tomas said. "I'm pulling it." The Development Authority was a public-private partnership body, 7 members, appointed by the mayor's office. Its minutes were public record. The authority had approved the Phase 2 development 18 months earlier, 4-3 vote. One of the 3 dissenting votes was a council member named Deirdre Obaseki, who had subsequently been subject to an ethics investigation that was resolved without finding but had been sufficiently damaging to ensure she didn't seek re-election. The 4th dissenting vote had been filed by a member named Evan Calloway, who had resigned from the authority 8 months ago for personal reasons and had not been reachable for comment by the local press since. The 7th member, one of the 4 who approved, was a man named Thomas Aldrin. Juno said it first, very quietly. Mrs. Aldrin, the neighbor, 63 years old, heard nothing unusual, left alone in Garrick's house with Marlowe on Monday evening. The silence in the room was absolute. Garrick didn't move. He was standing with both hands at his sides, completely still, and on his face was something Kalen had not seen there before. Not grief, which had been present all morning in the contained way of controlled grief, and not anger, which had been present as a structural component of his composure. This was something older and more fundamental. Betrayal has a specific gravity. It pulls differently than grief. It doesn't fall. It sets. "She's been our neighbor for 12 years, he said. Nobody said anything. Her husband came to Marlowe's birthday party. The words came out flat, not as emotion, but as inventory, as a man cataloging what he had trusted and is now calculating the cost of having trusted it. I shoveled her driveway 2 winters ago when her hip was bad. Garrick, Tomas said it carefully, the way you speak to someone standing close to something irrecoverable. I need a minute. We don't have a minute. Thomas said it with the compassion of a man who genuinely hated having to say it. We don't. I'm sorry. We need to decide right now whether we... The front door of Raven Forge opened. 2 men came in. Not Ravens. They were dressed in the way that private security dressed when it wanted to present as administrative rather than physical. Dark slacks, gray jackets, lanyards with laminated credentials. Fit in the particular overfit way that suggested training rather than gym. One was in his 30s, dark hair, a quality of contained attention that was professional and old. The other was younger, wider, positioned slightly behind and to the left in the way that functioned as threat geometry. They stopped just inside the door. The room had been full of kinetic energy 10 seconds before. Now it was still in the way that a room full of men who know how to fight goes still when something walks in. Mr. Cade, the older one said. He had a voice designed for conference rooms, smooth, modulated, the practiced warmth of someone who communicated value via tone. My name is Harlan Moss. I represent the security interests of the Riverfront Phase 2 development partners. We understand you're conducting an unauthorized search involving our property, and I'd like to resolve this. Get out of my building, Garrick said. Moss didn't move. I appreciate this is an emotional... I said, get out of my building. The room had compressed. Not physically. No one had moved. Everyone was precisely where they had been. But in the way a room compresses when every person in it has made a simultaneous calculation and arrived at the same conclusion about how the next 30 seconds could go. Kalen, in the back corner, had stopped breathing in the shallow, unconscious way he stopped breathing when things tipped. Moss looked around the room, at the maps, the satellite imagery, the evidence laid on the cloth table, at the faces of 16 men and Juno Vance, who looked back at him with the uniform quality of people who had been past the point of patience before he walked in. His assessment was quick and professional and arrived clearly at the correct conclusion. We're not here to cause problems, he said. We're here to provide clarity. Our client's position is that the search of any riverfront development property requires coordination with site management for everyone's safety. Her name is Marlowe, Juno said. She said it quietly from across the room, but the room carried it. She's 8 years old and she has asthma and she's been missing for 16 hours. Her name is Marlowe. Say it. Moss looked at Juno. Something crossed his face that he controlled quickly. Ma'am. Say her name. The younger man behind Moss shifted his weight fractionally. Cole, who was standing 6 feet from them near the parts counter, moved nothing except his eyes, but the shift of his gaze made the younger man go still again. Moss said, I understand the urgency of the situation. Do you? Garrick said. It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped into a register that Kalen had not heard from him before. Not loud, not aggressive, but carrying a quality of absolute finality that made the back of Kalen's neck tighten. Because I'm starting to think you understand a great deal about this situation, more than a man representing a construction company's legal interests should understand about a missing child. Moss's expression did not change. This was itself information. That his expression did not change, that he had enough preparation to not let it change. I came here in good faith to Tomas? Garrick said. Tomas had his phone out, already recording. He held it up without drama. You walked into a registered private business, Garrick continued. You've identified yourself as a representative of an entity that our preliminary information connects to activities relevant to an ongoing search for a missing minor. This conversation is being recorded. You can leave on your own or you can keep talking, and I'll add whatever you say next to the file we're building." He paused. "Last chance." Moss looked at him for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible only as a slight quality of increased stillness, the way people look when they're doing arithmetic under social pressure. Then he said very evenly, "We'll be in touch," and turned and left, the younger man following. The door closed. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Tomas said, "They know what we have. That's why they came." "They came to buy time," Wrench said. "Every minute they kept us talking is a minute someone else is moving something, deleting something, repositioning." He was already at the map. "We need to go, now." "The police on the lot," Cole started. "They're not going to stop us leaving," Garrick said. "They're watching. There's a difference." He looked around the room with the particular quality of attention that meant he was taking inventory. 12 through the drain access. 4 stay here. I need eyes on this building, and I need someone running communications. He looked at Petra. "Everything you found goes to Deirdre Obaseki's office, and 2 independent journalists in the next 15 minutes, not as a backup, as simultaneous. Anyone asking questions about the development makes it harder to bury what's happening." "Done," Petra said. Garrick looked at Kaylin. And here was the moment. Kaylin saw it clearly. The way you see the moment a current changes direction when you've spent enough time in water. Garrick was going to tell him to stay. It was the logical decision. Kaylin was 17. He was not a member of this club. He had no training or standing or claim on the risk being organized in this room. Keeping him here was the responsible call. Kaylin said, before Garrick could speak, "I know what the drain access looks like at the salvage yard. I've slept in that building. I know where the utility hatch is open." Garrick went still. "I've been in there," Kaylin said, 3 weeks ago, when the shelter was full. The east wing is unlocked if you know which panel to push, and the old utility room in the basement has a maintenance hatch that opens to the Phase 1 drain connector. I've been down there." Wrench looked at him sharply. "You've been in the drain system?" "Not far, just the first section. 40 feet maybe, before I turned back because I couldn't see." Wrench looked at Garrick. "He's a guide." "He's a kid," Tomas said. "He's a kid who's been in the entry point," Wrench said. "None of us have." The argument was tight and fast and conducted in the clipped economy of men who made decisions under time pressure and knew how to do it. Tomas and Juno on one side, the risk to Kaylin, the liability, the simple moral calculus of bringing a teenager into what might become a confrontation. Cole and Wrench on the other, the operational value of a guide at the entry point, someone who'd physically navigated the initial access, the minutes that knowledge would save. Garrick listened to both sides for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, "Kaylin," and waited. Kaylin understood the question wasn't, "Do you want to come?" It was, "Are you sure you know what you're agreeing to?" "She's alone down there," Kaylin said, "and she's running out of time." It was not an argument. It was a statement of what was true, and everyone in the room understood that it was sufficient. "Full stay-back position," Garrick said to Tomas. "He does not go past the connector junction." Thomas looked unhappy but nodded. "You stay with Juno," Garrick said to Kaylin. "When she stops, you stop. When she moves back, you move back. You do not separate from her under any circumstances. Understood?" "Understood." "If it goes wrong," Garrick said, "you tell them you were lost. You found the hatch by accident. You don't know any of us." "That's not—" "Understood," Garrick said again, firmly, not a question this time. Kaylin looked at him. Thought about the 20 minutes Garrick had asked for earlier, what a man like this used 20 minutes for. Thought about Mrs. Aldrin's kitchen, about the fox stitched with a name, about 17 years of nobody making specific arrangements for what happened to him if things went wrong. "Understood," he said. They left Raven Forge at 12:19 in 3 groups, through 3 different exits, at 4-minute intervals. Not on the bikes. That surprised Kaylin until it didn't. The bikes were what the surveillance expected. The bikes were visible and loud and traceable. The bikes were the bait. They moved in vehicles, 2 panel vans and a truck with contractor markings that Kaylin suspected were not accidental props, spread across different routes to the salvage yard's eastern access, via a routing that avoided every camera placement Tomas had mapped from Petra's reconnaissance. Kaylin rode in the second van, between Juno and a raven called Frost, who was tall and angular and operated in absolute silence, and whose left hand, Kalen noticed, was missing the ring finger from the second knuckle. Frost held a bag across his knees that contained things Kalen decided not to ask about. The van moved through the back streets of Duskfield in the gray November midday, and the city outside the windows looked like itself. Ordinary, indifferent, its systems proceeding without reference to what was happening in its storm drains and its empty construction sites. Kalen watched it through the window and thought about the way cities did that. The way the ordinary surface maintained itself regardless of what was occurring beneath it. He had lived beneath the surface of ordinary for long enough to know how thoroughly one could be invisible inside it. Juno sat with her medical bag on her lap and looked at her hands and said nothing. Her preparation was interior. He could see it, the controlled breathing, the deliberate relaxation of her shoulders, the kind of pre-operational calm that was built rather than found. He recognized it because he did something similar before situations that required it, though his situations were smaller and his preparation was less formal and had been developed by necessity rather than training. "Has she ever had a serious attack?" he asked quietly. Juno looked at him. "What Garrick told me, she had one when she was 6. Hospitalization, 4 days." She paused. "She's managed it well since, but she knows how to be scared of it. She'd be trying not to panic. She'd be trying very hard." He looked out the window. "That takes a lot out of you." Juno was quiet for a moment. "Yes." The van stopped. Chachant. The salvage yard's east wing was what Kalen had described, a long corrugated metal structure that had originally processed automotive scrap and had not processed anything in at least a decade. The east access panel responded exactly as he'd told them it would. Third panel from the drainage corner, the bottom bracket had rusted free. The whole section pivoted inward if you knew the pressure point. He showed Wrench the angle. Wrench pressed it, and the panel swung, and the dark interior smell of the building came out at them. Cold concrete, old oil, the specific mustiness of enclosed space that doesn't breathe. Wrench looked at the opening, then at Kalen, then at Garrick. "He's right," Wrench said, not with surprise, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose assessment has been confirmed. They moved inside in single file, flashlights low, footfalls managed. The salvage yard's interior had the skeletal quality of emptied industrial spaces. Steel shelving stripped of inventory, processing equipment frozen in mid-function, a floor thick with dust that held their footprints like a record. Kalen moved through it with the particular ease of someone for whom navigating abandoned spaces was functional rather than adventurous. He didn't perform comfort, he simply had it, which was different. The utility room was where he'd said, "Northwest corner of the basement access," a door that had been locked when he first found it and was still locked, but Wrench produced a key that fitted on the second try, which suggested the information network he'd been working had been more specific than he'd let on. Inside, the maintenance hatch was set into the floor beneath an overturned workbench. A steel ring handle, cold, grit-packed, requiring 2 hands and 1 knee on the surrounding floor to shift. Wrench and Cole moved the bench. Wrench pulled the hatch. It came up with a sound of old suction giving way. A deep exhalation from below, the smell of standing water and cold concrete and something else, something chemical and mineral that Kalen associated with the Phase 2 construction dust Wrench had identified on the bank. Below, a metal ladder dropped into darkness. Flashlight beams found the bottom. A concrete channel, water maybe an inch deep at the edge. More in the center, the walls close enough that a large man's shoulders would brush both sides. 12 ravens and Juno Vance and 1 homeless 17-year-old stood at the edge of that hatch and looked down into the dark. Garrick was first down the ladder. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't stand at the top and look around at his people and say anything that the moment seemed to call for. He just stepped onto the first rung and descended, and his flashlight beam swept the tunnel below, and he said, "Clear, come down." And they came down. The drain network was everything the map had suggested and nothing the map had prepared them for in terms of its physical reality. The tunnel was low. Garrick and Cole had to move with a slight duck, their cut edges brushing the ceiling. And the water on the floor was not the inch the flashlights had suggested at the hatch, but closer to 6 inches, the kind of cold that hit the bones immediately and stayed there. The walls wept moisture. The sound was a constant low rush and drip, the dark pressing in at the edge of every flashlight beam, the space ahead appearing only incrementally as they moved. They moved in a column, Wrench at the front navigating by the hand-drawn map he'd transferred to a waterproof sleeve. Garrick directly behind him. Tomas third. Juno with Kaylin in the middle of the group, which was where Garrick had placed them deliberately. The others spread behind. The cold was extraordinary. Not the sharp cold of wind or moving air, but the settled cold of subterranean space, the kind that doesn't fluctuate and doesn't relent and has been the same temperature in this specific place for as long as the concrete has been here. Kaylin felt it come through his boots within 3 minutes and settle into his ankles and begin working upward. He thought about Marlowe, whether she'd been down here for some portion of the 16 hours, whether wherever she was now was this cold or colder, whether an 8-year-old body in cold like this for 16 hours had consequences that were distinct from the asthma consequences. He kept these thoughts in a controlled place, separate from the operational part of his attention, which was focused on the tunnel geometry and the sound and the way Juno was moving ahead of him, because those were the things he could actually use. They moved for 11 minutes before Wrench stopped. He stopped with the particular quality of stillness that meant he'd heard something rather than seen something. His flashlight went down, not off, but angled at the floor, reducing their visible profile. Behind him, the column stopped in sequence, each man reading the cessation from the one ahead. Silence, except for the water. Then, from somewhere ahead and above, muffled, unclear, but unmistakable once heard, voices. Not Marlowe's voice. Adult voices, the flat, short register of men doing logistics. Garrick's flashlight had gone to the floor the moment Wrench stopped. In the near dark, Kaylin could see his profile. The absolute stillness, the quality of a man taking information in and doing nothing visible with it yet. Tomas moved forward to Wrench. They conferred in absolute silence, hands, lip shapes, the compressed sign language of people who had operated together in conditions that required it. Wrench pointed ahead and slightly right. His hand indicated, that way, some distance, elevated. Above them, somewhere in the Phase 2 structure. Armed, Kaylin assumed. He assumed this because of the bag Frost had carried and the way Tomas had looked at the entry point before descending and the quality of the silence the men around him were now maintaining. He was standing in 6 inches of water in a concrete tunnel 40 feet below a city that was going about its business, surrounded by 12 men who had come here for an 8-year-old girl with red hair and a missing stuffed fox. And the voices above them belonged to people who had planned this and had resources and a connection to the city's power structure. And they were all about to walk directly into whatever was waiting. And then, from a different direction, not above, not ahead, but lateral, from a tributary channel somewhere to the left of their current position, came a sound that stopped everything. A cough. Small. Tired. The specific constricted sound of airways that were working too hard. It came once, and then there was a silence that was worse than the sound. And then it came again. Weak, with an edge of effort in it that Kaylin recognized even without context, because he had heard it in the shelter at night when the kid in the next bunk had bad chest weeks and was trying not to wake anyone. Garrick heard it. He heard it, and something in him that had been held under extreme tension for 16 hours simply released. Not into grief, not into relief, because it was too early for either, but into absolute certainty of direction. His body turned toward the sound before his mind had finished processing it. Tomas caught his arm, silent, urgent. His eyes moved toward the ceiling, toward the voices above. Garrick looked at him. His eyes said what his voice couldn't. Tomas's eyes said, I know, but if they hear us, Garrick's eyes said, she's coughing. And Tomas closed his eyes for 1 second and then let go of Garrick's arm. They moved left. The tributary channel was narrower, one at a time, the flashlights fully killed now, moving by feel and the thin ambient luminescence of whatever light seeped through the Phase 2 structure's unsealed gaps above. The water was deeper here. It hit Kaylin's shins, and the cold of it was electric and sharp, and he moved through it with his hand on the wall and his other hand on Juno's sleeve, and he could feel Juno moving with the controlled urgency of a woman who had been preparing for this moment since she understood what the inhaler in the backpack meant. The channel bent, and around the bend, in the dark, a flashlight would have been too much. So it was Juno who went first, slowly, and found it by sound and by the warmth that a living body produces even in extreme cold, the way a person in a cold space is always slightly warmer than the space around them. She said very softly, "Marlo." The breathing changed, and then, in a voice that was almost no voice at all, thread thin, exhausted, but present, fiercely present, the way 8-year-olds are present when they're frightened and trying not to show it, came, "My dad said someone would come." The sound that Garrett Cade made in that moment was not a word, and not a name, and not anything with a definition, but Kaylin heard it in the dark and felt it somewhere that didn't have a name either, somewhere that had been empty for a long time, and registered the sound the way a cold room registers heat, suddenly, completely, and with a quality of recognition that felt older than the moment itself. And above them, through the concrete, came the hard, rhythmic sound of boots, multiple sets, moving fast, converging. They had been heard. The boots above them were not running. That was the first thing Kaylin registered. Not running, which would have meant alarm, but moving with the deliberate, measured cadence of a search pattern, which meant they had not been heard, which meant something else had triggered the movement above. This was, in its way, worse. A search pattern meant procedure. Procedure meant they had anticipated this route. Garrick was already moving, back toward Juno, who had Marlo pressed against the channel wall with one arm around her and the other hand feeling the girl's chest through her jacket with the particular focused touch of someone reading a body-like text. Marlo was small and very cold, and her breathing was the sound of a door that needed oil. Each inhale a slight catch, each exhale a thin wheeze, the pattern of early-stage bronchospasm that Juno had been calculating against since the morning. "Inhaler," Juno said. Not loud, not a whisper. The specific volume of a word that needed to travel exactly one body length and no further. Frost had the medical bag open before she finished saying it. The backup inhaler, not Marlo's, a clinical replacement the same formulation, was in Juno's hand in 4 seconds. Marlo looked at it, then at Juno. Then, in the dark, with the boots moving above them in their measured pattern, she said, still in that thread-thin voice, but with something in it that was stubbornly intact, the particular intactness of a child who has decided to be brave and is executing that decision with everything she has. "Is my dad here?" "He's here," Juno said. The sound Marlo made was not crying. It was the sound of a held breath being released, the sound of a body that has been running on its own resources for 16 hours, receiving confirmation that the resources were no longer the only thing available. Her shoulders dropped a centimeter. Her next inhale was still constricted, but slightly deeper than the previous one. Garrett came around Juno's shoulder and crouched in the 6-inch water without appearing to notice the cold or the wet, and he put his hand against Marlo's face, and she put both her hands over his hand, and he said nothing because there was nothing that words were equipped to carry in that moment. Above them, the boots stopped. Complete silence, except for the water and Marlo's breathing. Tomas, behind Kaylin, had gone absolutely still. Kaylin could feel rather than see the calculation happening. The distance to the nearest junction, the number of bodies in the tunnel, the ratio of mobility to noise given the water depth. His own heartbeat was doing something irregular and purposeful against his sternum, and he breathed through it the way he breathed through things that required management. The boots moved again, south, away from their position. Then a voice, above and south, muffled by concrete but unmistakable in its quality, the flat, operationally modulated voice of someone running a position check. Not Moss. Someone junior to Moss, someone who took orders and confirmed them. The words were inaudible. The cadence was military adjacent. Not military, but trained in the same architecture, the structure of people who had learned communication protocols in environments where clarity was survival. Wrench touched Garrick's shoulder from the left. His hand indicated junction, 60 feet back, branch north. Garrick looked at Marlo. She had the inhaler between her lips and her eyes closed, Juno's hand on her sternum counting the dose, and she looked, even now, even here, like a child who had decided to trust the adults around her, which was perhaps the most frightening thing Kaylin had seen all day, because it required that the adults be trustworthy and the situation be manageable, and neither of those things was currently guaranteed. Garrick stood. He looked at Wrench and nodded, and they moved. Back through the tributary channel in the same single-file silence. Juno carrying Marlowe now because Marlowe's legs were unreliable from cold, and Marlowe, to her credit, had not objected to this but had simply put her arms around Juno's neck with a pragmatism that suggested she had already assessed the situation and determined that pride was a secondary concern. They made it back to the main channel junction. Then the lights came on. Not flashlights, floodlights. Industrial portable units, the kind used on night construction sites, mounted at the tunnel entrance 50 feet to their north and switched simultaneously with the quality of prepared deployment. The tunnel filled with white light that after the complete dark hit like a physical force. Kaylin's eyes contracted painfully, and he heard Marlowe make a small involuntary sound against Juno's shoulder. In the light, 5 men. Tactical gear. Not police tactical, private contractor tactical. The kind that had no badge and no accountability visible on its surface, but was equipped identically to anything with a badge. They were positioned in a spread across the tunnel width, which was wide enough here to allow it, and they were not rushing because they didn't need to rush. Behind them, a 6th man. Harlan Moss. Dry, unhurried, his gray jacket still neat. He had apparently used a different access point than the salvage yard hatch, a point that gave him dry shoes and the positioning of someone who had been waiting rather than pursuing. He looked at Garrick across 50 feet of lit tunnel and water, and 12 ravens, and 1 medic, and 1 17-year-old, and 1 small pale girl with her face against a medic's shoulder. "Mr. Cade," he said, the conference room voice, completely unperturbed. "I told you we'd be in touch." Now, what happened next occurred in a compressed interval of approximately 4 seconds that contained, in Kaylin's subsequent memory, far more than 4 seconds worth of information. Garrick moved first, not toward Moss, but laterally, putting himself between Moss's position and Juno and Marlowe in a movement so immediate it appeared to have happened before the decision to make it, the way certain responses are stored below the level of deliberation. Cole and Dax moved in his wake, filling the space he'd vacated. Wrench, who was behind and to the left, stepped back against the wall and put his hand on the wall in a way that suggested he was thinking about what was behind it. And Tomas stepped forward, past Garrick, into the space between the group and Moss's 5, in the particular way that a sergeant-at-arms steps forward, not as aggression, but as position, as a statement about where the boundary was. Moss watched this with the expression of a man watching a demonstration he's already seen. "There are 6 more above ground," Moss said, "and Detective Lehman has a warrant for the entire structure. Unauthorized entry, destruction of property, interfering with a law enforcement operation." He paused. "He'll add the juvenile to the report." "She's a child," Tomas said. "She's a minor on a restricted construction site, accompanied by individuals who—" "She's a child," Tomas said again, and the second time there was something in his voice that the first time hadn't had. Not volume, but weight, the specific weight of a man who has run out of patience for a particular kind of language and is no longer bothering to perform engagement with it. Moss looked past Tomas at Garrick. "This doesn't have to escalate." "Someone took my daughter," Garrick said. His voice was steady, every word its own sentence. "Someone with a keycard registered to your client. Someone who knew her medical condition. Someone who knew her neighbor's name." He let a beat pass. "Tell me why it doesn't have to escalate." Something shifted in Moss's expression. Not fear. Moss did not appear to have access to fear in any standard configuration, but a recalibration. A man adjusting his approach because the one he had prepared was no longer optimal. "The people responsible for this are not my client," Moss said. "Then who is your client?" A pause. In the pause, Kaylin watched Moss's eyes move. A quick survey of the tunnel, the group, the child. Calculating. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Not warmer, more deliberate. "Thomas Aldrin came to us 4 days ago, not as a board member, as a private individual with a serious problem. Moss looked at the floor briefly, then back at Garrick. He was being blackmailed. The people running the operation on this site, they had documentation. His financial dealings with the development authority, his vote, the kickback structure. Another pause. They told him the price of their silence was cooperation, access to the site after hours, key personnel schedules. His eyes moved briefly to Marlowe, and one specific piece of leverage. The tunnel went very quiet. "Marlowe," Garrick said. The word came out flat, emptied. They needed something that guaranteed you wouldn't go to the press, wouldn't cooperate with whatever investigation was forming. The development has federal funding. If the kickback structure came out, Moss stopped, recalibrated again. Aldrin didn't know they would take her. He believed the arrangement was informational only. When she was taken, he panicked. Mrs. Aldrin was not aware of the extent of her husband's involvement. The silence that followed this was the kind that has a shape, a specific, terrible shape, like the space left by something that has been removed. Kalen, standing in water to his shins, watched Garrick process this. Watched a man who had spent 16 hours in the contained posture of managed grief receive information that restructured the entire geography of his situation. The neighbor who had shoveled snow for. The birthday party. 12 years. The particular devastating intimacy of a betrayal by proximity. Not by an enemy, not by a stranger, but by someone who had used the fact of knowing you as a tool against you. Garrick said nothing for a long time. Then, "Where are they?" "I don't have that information." "Who does?" "Mr. Cade." "Who does?" And here was the thing about Garrick Cade's voice in that moment. It was not loud. It had not increased in volume at any point in this conversation, but it had passed through some threshold that volume doesn't measure. The threshold that separates the controlled performance of stability from the thing underneath the performance when the performance has reached its limit. Every one of Moss's 5 men registered it without visibly responding, which was its own indicator. Moss looked at him. Some genuine thing passed through his expression, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The look of a professional who, despite everything, is standing in front of something he can identify as real. "A man named Rourke Velden," Moss said. "He runs a private asset management company as a front. He's the beneficial owner of the Cayman Fund. He's been using the development to clean money for 18 months. Aldrin was the inside man who didn't know what he was the inside man for until it was too late." He paused. "Velden is not on site. He's not been on site. The men here are contractors. They don't know the full picture." "But you do," Tomas said. Moss looked at him. "I know enough." "Then why are you here?" Cole said from behind Thomas. His voice was low and even and carried the quality of a straightforward question that wasn't straightforward. "Your client is compromised. The operation is compromised. Why are you standing in a tunnel instead of walking away?" Moss was quiet for a moment. "Because I have a daughter," he said. "She's 11. Nobody said anything. "I'm going to tell my team above that the site is clear," Moss said. "I'm going to tell Lehman that his information about the Raven's location was inaccurate. That gives you approximately 8 minutes before he repositions." He looked at Garrick. "The northeast maintenance exit opens to the Foundry District side street. There's a panel van staged there. One of mine, clean plates. Juno Vance can get the girl to Duskfield General in 6 minutes from the exit point." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a key card on the dry upper ledge of the drainage channel wall. "That opens the Phase 2 fire door at the northeast junction." He looked at the key card, then at Garrick. "Velden won't stop," he said. "Whatever you're planning after this, he won't stop. He has documentation on 12 public officials in this city. He has relationships with federal contracting structures. He is not a man you go after with evidence and a press contact and hope for the best." He picked up nothing, left the key card where it was. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand what you're walking into, and because I want you to walk into it informed." A pause, the last one, carrying something that was almost regret. "Get your daughter out of here." He looked at Marlowe once, directly, briefly, with the particular look of a person who is looking at a child and thinking about a different child. Then he turned and walked back toward his 5 men, and the 5 men parted for him and followed. and the floodlights stayed on, but the threat geometry of the tunnel changed entirely. Tomas had the keycard off the ledge before Moss's footsteps were fully gone. 8 minutes. The northeast junction was a 4-minute move through the main channel at controlled speed, which gave them 4 minutes of contingency and 0 margin for error, and nobody in the tunnel needed to be told this. Juno moved with Marlowe in a modified carry, the girl's arms around her neck, Juno's hands under her knees, moving through the water in a rhythm that was fast without jarring. Because jarring elevated respiratory rate, and elevated respiratory rate was the last thing they needed. She had administered 2 doses from the backup inhaler. The first had produced a measurable improvement. The catch in Marlowe's breathing was less pronounced, the exhale slightly fuller. The second dose was precautionary. Juno's face, while she moved, was the face of someone running calculations that she didn't share. Marlowe had not spoken since the tunnel lit up. She was conserving, Kaylin understood. Conserving breath, conserving energy, making the same calculation a body under stress makes when it understands that the resources are limited and the remaining distance is unknown. She had her face against Juno's shoulder and her eyes open, watching the tunnel walls go past with an expression that was too old for her face and would, at some future point, need to be addressed in some way that the current moment was entirely the wrong time to think about. Garrick moved beside Juno. He had not touched Marlowe again, not because he didn't want to, but because Juno had the carry position and any adjustment risked stability, and he understood this with the clarity of a man who has suppressed every personal instinct in service of the practical. But his body was oriented toward her with the absolute consistency of something that couldn't be managed away. A compass always pointing the same direction regardless of what was asked of it. Behind them, the Ravens moved with the focused economy of people who had shed all unnecessary weight. No conversation, no noise beyond boots and water, the occasional soft sound of equipment adjusting. Frost had the bag across his back and moved with the light, efficient stride of someone who had moved through confined spaces in worse conditions. Cole had taken the rearguard position, facing backward as they moved, checking the tunnel behind them with flashlight sweeps at intervals. Kaylin ran the math on what Moss had said. Rourke Velden, 18 months, 12 public officials, federal contracting. He knew what that meant in practical terms, not the specific legal architecture of it, but the shape of it, the way power worked when it ran deep enough to have multiple redundant layers. He'd grown up adjacent to a version of this on a smaller scale, in Millhaven, where everyone knew which businesses didn't pay the right people and which ones did, and what the consequences were for each, and the system's visibility was so total it had been background rather than foreground. This was that, scaled to a different order. And it meant that what they had done today, the drain access, the footage Petra had sent to journalists, the keycard, the van waiting at the northeast exit, was not a resolution. It was a confrontation with one surface layer of something that had far more layers beneath it, and Moss had told them this not as warning, but as a kind of practical courtesy. The way you'd tell someone the ground ahead was unstable because you respected them enough to not want them to fall through it uninformed. The northeast junction appeared at the edge of the flashlight range, a steel door, gray, industrial, mounted flush in the channel wall with a keycard reader mounted at shoulder height. Thomas swiped the card. The reader went green. The door released with a pressure equalization sound. Warm air from the other side, slightly warmer than the tunnel, carrying the smell of fresh concrete and construction materials, and something else. Something that Kaylin associated with the outdoors, even though they were still underground because the air had movement in it. Beyond the door, a maintenance corridor. Dry, fluorescent lit, the floor a simple rubber mat over concrete slab. It ran 20 feet to a stairwell. The stairwell went up. Garrick looked at Juno. She nodded. Marlowe is stable enough for the stairs. They went up. The fire door at street level opened into an alley on the Foundry District's east margin, a narrow slot between 2 industrial buildings, dumpsters along one wall. November cold dropping immediately on them as they came up from the underground warmth. The sky was low and gray, and the light had the quality of late afternoon coming early, the way it did in November, and the alley smelled like cold concrete and a dumpster's old rain. The van was there, white, clean, no signage, idling. The driver was one of Moss's people, a woman, late 30s, who rolled the window down when Garrick appeared, looked at Marlowe and Juno's arms with an expression that was entirely without professional distance, and said, "I know the fastest route to Duskfield General." Juno had Marlowe into the van's back before Garrick could say anything. She climbed in after her, the bag coming in, the door sliding shut. Garrick put his hand on the van's side panel for a moment, one moment, the kind that cost something, then stepped back. He looked at Tomas. "She goes," he said. "We don't." Tomas nodded. He'd known this was coming. The van would be visible, logged, traceable to Moss's company. Lehman would know about it within the hour, which meant everything they'd done in the tunnel would be on the official record within the hour, which meant the window for getting Marlowe to safety before the legal machinery activated was exactly as wide as the van's travel time to the hospital. They could have all gone, all climbed in, let Moss's driver take them out of the cordon. Garrick could have been in that van with his daughter right now. He wasn't. Kalen, standing at the alley entrance with his wet boots and Carhartt jacket and the particular cold of someone who has been in tunnel water for 40 minutes, understood this choice without having to think about it. Garrick in that van was Garrick unavailable for what came next. And what came next was not something he was prepared to hand to anyone else. And what came next was Veldin and the 12 public officials and the 18 months of layered corruption, and a system that had demonstrated today that it would use an 8-year-old girl as a piece of leverage and would have let that leverage work. The van pulled out of the alley. Garrick watched it go until it turned the corner and was gone. Then he turned back to his people, and his face had changed, not collapsed. He hadn't collapsed through any of this and wasn't going to now. But something in it had released. The controlled grief and the contained fear had had a reason to be contained, and the reason was now in a van with a medic and 4 minutes from a hospital, and what was left in Garrick's face without those things was something different and considerably less comfortable to be in the presence of. Cole said quietly, "They'll be waiting at the Foundry Road entrance." "I know," Garrick said. "Lehman's going to have the parking lot covered within the hour." "I know. What do we do?" Garrick looked at the alley walls, at the gray sky above, at the faces of 11 men who had been awake for 18-plus hours and were standing in wet boots in a Foundry District alley in November, and were looking at him with the quality of people who had already decided what their answer was going to be and were waiting for the question to be formally posed. "Rourke Veldin," Garrick said. "Moss gave us a name. Petra has the documentation chain. Deirdre Obaseki has been sitting on this development for 18 months, waiting for something she could use." He paused. "We give her the complete picture, and we give it to her in the next 2 hours before Lehman or Veldin can move any of the pieces." "That's not enough," Tomas said. "I know it's not enough on its own. Veldin has 12 officials. He has legal structures in 3 jurisdictions. You can't pull that down from outside the system." "No," Garrick agreed, "but you can make it impossible for the system to ignore." He looked at Tomas. "Every journalist Petra contacted this morning, every record Petra pulled from the contractor system, Obaseki's office, the Federal Oversight Committee for the Development Funding, they have a public complaint mechanism. Wrench found it 2 years ago when we were trying to—" He stopped. "And we need one more thing." He looked at Kalen. Kalen, who had been standing at the alley entrance functioning as peripheral and invisible in the way he had spent years learning to function, felt the directness of the lookland and had nowhere to move it. "You've been a witness to everything today," Garrick said. "The creek, the drag marks, Moss and the tunnel, what he told us about Veldin and Aldrin." He paused. "Your testimony is clean. You're not a member of this club. You have no prior relationship with the development, with Lehman, with any of the parties involved. You found the backpack at 6:47 this morning, and you can walk through everything that happened between then and now in a factual account that cannot be attributed to bias or self-interest." Another pause. "If you're willing." The alley was cold. The sky was darker than it had been 5 minutes ago. Somewhere to the west, too far to place, the sound of Harleys, not Lehman's pursuit, not contractor vehicles, but the Ravens who had stayed at Foundry Road, moving now, repositioning on Tomas's last text before the tunnel. Kalen thought about what it meant to be a clean witness, about what it meant to be nobody, specifically, instrumentally, nobody, in a way that was actually useful. He had spent 17 years being invisible because visibility had not been safe, and here was the first circumstance in which the invisibility was a resource rather than a wound. He thought about Juno saying, "People make choices before they walk." "Okay," he said. Garrick nodded once. Then, to the group. "We need dry ground and a phone signal. Wrench." Wrench was already moving toward the alley's far end. 2 blocks, old pressing plant. It's been empty since March, but the power's still running. I know the foreman. Of course he did. They moved. The pressing plant was warm in the way that industrial buildings retained warmth, structural, ambient, the heat of old machinery and sealed volume. It smelled like lubricant and cardboard, and the specific dry warmth of a space that had been worked in for decades. The lights came on when Wrench found the panel, fluorescent, uneven, 2 fixtures buzzing, and threw the space into the particular quality of industrial light that makes faces look like they're made of harder materials than they are. Petra was on the line before they were fully inside. Her voice through Thomas's phone carried the tight focus of someone who had been running multiple operations simultaneously and had been waiting for this contact with something beyond patience. "Marlowe's at the hospital," she said immediately. Juno texted from the van. "She's breathing. They're taking her straight to the ER." Nobody said anything for a moment. The particular silence of information that doesn't need a response, because the response is already happening inside each of them and doesn't require external expression. "What do you have, John?" Garrick said. "More than we had this morning. The Cayman Fund, I found a 2019 federal contractor filing with a subsidiary disclosure. Veldon's name is on the subsidiary as a silent partner. That's a documented federal connection, which means the Oversight Committee has mandatory jurisdiction if someone files a formal complaint with supporting documentation." A pause. "Deirdre Obaseki's office has been on hold with me for 40 minutes. She wants to talk to you directly." "Put her through." A click. A brief silence. Then a woman's voice. Controlled, measured, the voice of someone who had been in rooms full of men who wanted her to stop talking for long enough to have stopped being afraid of those rooms. "Mr. Cade, I've seen Petra's documentation. I've also been contacted by 2 journalists who have the same documentation with an embargo they've agreed to hold until I've had a chance to respond formally." A pause. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Veldon's connection to the federal development funding isn't incidental. If the documentation holds, it holds," Garrick said. "Then this goes federal within 24 hours. But I need Lehman neutralized first. He has the warrant, and he has discretion on how he executes it, and if he moves on your location before I can file, how long do you need?" 6 hours. "I have less than 6 hours before he finds us." A pause. "I know. I'm telling you what I need, and I'm telling you what I have. I can have a federal complaint filed in 4. That doesn't stop Lehman, but it creates a record that makes it significantly harder for anything he does afterward to be quietly buried." Another pause. "What I need from you in exchange is the witness account. Unfiltered. On record." Garrick looked at Kaylin across the pressing plant floor. Kaylin was already looking at him. "He'll give it," Garrick said. "All right." Obaseki's voice shifted. Still controlled, but with something beneath it that had been there all along and was now slightly more surface accessible. Something that sounded like the specific costly variety of determination that comes from being right about something for 18 months while being systematically prevented from acting on it. "There's something else. The Aldrin connection. Thomas Aldrin was cooperating with Veldon under duress. He came to my office 3 weeks ago. He was frightened and incoherent, and I told him to come back with documentation. He never came back." A pause that carried weight. "I should have pushed harder. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that this system failed multiple times and in multiple directions before today. That's not an excuse. It's context." Garrick said nothing, received it, filed it. 4 hours, he said. "We'll hold until then." The call ended. Tomas had been listening from the edge of the group, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the quality of a man who has heard both sides of something and is working out whether the math closes. He waited until the silence after the call was fully established, and then he said, "There's a problem." "I know," Garrick said. "Veldon knows what we have. Moss works for him." Moss made a choice in that tunnel. Moss made a choice. He still works for Veldin until he doesn't. If Veldin has communications on any of our phones, on Petra's access, on Obaseki's line, then he knows we're filing in 4 hours and he'll move everything he can move in 4 hours. Garrick's voice was even. Which is why I need Birch and Dax on the Aldrin house right now. Not aggressive. Present. Thomas Aldrin is the only person in this city who can corroborate Moss's account from the inside, and he's also the only person Veldin can eliminate to simplify his position. The word eliminate landed in the room with its full weight. Nobody flinched from it. These were men who had understood since the tunnel that they were not dealing with the level of risk that flinched at. Tomas was already on his phone. Cole had moved to the pressing plant's side window and was watching the street with the flat, regular attention of a man doing perimeter work. His body language communicated nothing alarming, which was itself a kind of continuous information. Wrench had sat down on an overturned crate and was looking at his bad knee with the expression of a man having a private conversation with it about what was still required of it. He looked up, felt Kalen looking, and said without particular drama, "You holding up?" Kalen thought about what an honest answer to that question looked like. "I'm okay. You're in wet boots in a cold building after 6 hours in a tunnel, and you haven't eaten since whenever you last ate." Wrench's voice was the same texture it always was, dry, specific, without the performance of warmth, but also without its absence. "That's not the same as okay. I'll be okay." "Different thing," Wrench agreed. He reached into his jacket and produced a protein bar, the kind that came in industrial bulk, the kind that people who moved through difficult circumstances kept on their persons as a matter of habit, and held it out without standing up. Kalen took it. "Thanks." "Don't thank me." Wrench looked back at his knee. "Eat." Kalen ate. The bar tasted like chocolate-flavored cardboard, and it was the best thing he'd had since the coffee at Raven Forge that morning, and he understood, eating it in a fluorescent-lit pressing plant with wet boots and the cold of tunnel water still in his shins, that this was going to be one of those days that divided time, before and after. He didn't yet know what after looked like. He was still building the before chain, moment by moment, in a room full of men who were doing the same thing. His phone buzzed. Cracked screen, 12%. An unknown number. He looked at it for a second, then answered, silence on the line. Then, a voice he didn't recognize. Low, clear, the voice of a man who was accustomed to speaking and being heard. "I know where you are," the voice said. "I know who you're with, and I know what you've given to Obaseki's office." A pause, precisely calibrated. "The boy. Tell Cade that what he's building is a structure with one load-bearing wall, and I know which wall it is." The line went dead. Kalen stood with the phone in his hand. The pressing plant hummed around him. Tomas on the phone across the room, Garrick at the window with Cole, Wrench on his crate with his bad knee and his particular quality of stillness. None of them had heard. None of them knew that Rourke Veldin, or someone who spoke for Rourke Veldin, had just called a homeless 17-year-old's prepaid phone, which meant Veldin knew about the phone, which meant Veldin had access to something that should have been invisible, which meant the load-bearing wall Veldin had referenced was Kalen himself. He looked at Garrick's back across the room, at the set of those shoulders, at the particular posture of a man who had already given everything the morning had asked for and was preparing to give whatever the afternoon would ask for as well. Kalen thought about the choice he'd made at 6:47 that morning, in the mud at the creek bank, when he'd looked at a phone and looked at a backpack and made a calculation about who he trusted with what he'd found. He thought about 17 years of doing his own logistics. He thought about the protein bar in his hand and Wrench's voice saying, "Don't thank me," and what that meant from a man like that. He thought about the voice on the phone. One load-bearing wall. He lowered the phone. He looked at the floor. He breathed. Then he walked across the pressing plant toward Garrick, because whatever was coming next, he was not going to be the thing that came apart in someone else's. Kalen walked across the pressing plant and said, "Someone called my phone." The room stopped. Garrick turned from the window. His eyes went to the phone in Kalen's hand, then to Kalen's face, and what he read there made him cross the distance between them in 3 steps. When? 30 seconds ago. Unknown number. He said he knows where we are. He knows what we gave Obaseki. Kalen kept his voice flat. Flat was the only gear available right now. He called it a structure with one load-bearing wall, said to tell you he knows which wall it is. The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Tomas said, "He's on the phone network. He has access to Kalen's number, which means he has access to the prepaid registry, which means he has someone inside the carrier or inside Lehman's operation pulling records in real time." He looked at Garrick. "He's not bluffing about knowing where we are." "He's not bluffing about the wall either," Wrench said from his crate. He was looking at Kalen. "The boy's testimony is the only account that isn't coming from a club member. Petra's documentation is digital. It can be challenged, delayed, buried in discovery. Obaseki's complaint is procedural. It moves at the speed of institutions." He paused. "A 17-year-old witness with no affiliation and no motive is the thing that doesn't have a procedural counter. That's the wall." Cole turned from the window. "Then they're coming here." "They're already coming," Garrick said. He looked at Kalen. Something moved through his expression. Not apology, because apology was insufficient and both of them knew it, but a specific weighted recognition. The look of a man who has asked something of someone and is now watching the cost of that ask materialize in real time. "I'm sorry." "Don't," Kalen said. "Just tell me what we do." They had 4 minutes before Birch's voice came through the radio with the particular compression of urgent information delivered at speed. 2 vehicles on the south approach, moving without headlights, and a third coming from the Foundry Road direction that was not Lehman's people and was not Raven's. Veldon's contractors. Not waiting for Obaseki's 4 hours. Not interested in the procedural math. Garrick made the calls in the following 90 seconds with the speed of a man who had spent years making decisions in compressed intervals and had the neurological architecture for it by now. Dax and Birch holding the south approach, not blocking, redirecting, buying time on the street level. Cole and Frost on the plant's east access. Wrench to the interior with Kalen, away from the windows because Wrench's knee was what it was, and because Kalen was the wall, and the wall did not stand in front of glass. Tomas was already outside. Kalen didn't see him go. He was simply present and then not present, which was consistent with everything about Tomas Reeve. And then Garrick's phone rang. He looked at it. A number Kalen couldn't see from the angle. Something in Garrick's face shifted. Not much, but Kalen had been reading faces for 17 years as a survival mechanism, and he caught it. Garrick answered. "Cade." A pause, listening, his jaw set. "Say that again." Another pause. "If you touch a single person in that hospital—" He stopped. Whatever came through the line stopped him mid-sentence, which was not something that had happened once in the entire day. His hand on the phone went very still. "Marlowe," he said. It came out like something falling. Kalen's stomach dropped. Garrick lowered the phone. His face had the quality of a surface that has been struck from the inside. He looked at the phone for 1 long second, and then he looked at Kalen, and in his eyes was something that Kalen had no complete framework for. A man at the absolute outer boundary of what he could be asked to hold. "Veldon has someone at the hospital," Garrick said. "He says if Kalen's statement goes to Obaseki, they don't leave." The pressing plant was completely silent. "He's bluffing," Tomas said from the doorway. He had come back in, quiet as he'd left. "He cannot touch a child in a hospital without—" "He took her once already," Garrick said. His voice was very quiet. "From my house. From a neighbor I trusted for 12 years. With asthma documentation he shouldn't have had access to." He looked at Tomas. "Tell me again what he can't do." Tomas was silent. Outside, the sound of an engine. Close. Then another. The quality of vehicles arriving rather than passing. Kalen said, "Call it off." Every head turned. "The statement. Call it off. Tell Veldon you're pulling it." He looked at Garrick. "Get Juno out of the hospital with Marlowe. Get them somewhere he can't reach. Then refile." "The window closes," Tomas said. "If Obaseki doesn't get it in the next 3 hours, then we reopen the window." Kalen heard his own voice from a slight distance, the way you heard yourself in the moments when you were operating below the level of deliberation. "He wants me to be the wall." Fine, I'll be the wall. But I'll be the wall standing somewhere he doesn't control. Garrick looked at him for a long moment. Then something happened that Kaylin did not expect. Garrick crossed to him, not fast, not with urgency, and put one hand on his shoulder, and the weight of it was the specific weight of a large man's hand placed with intention, and he said quietly, "You are not a piece on a board." Kaylin didn't have an answer for this. "You're a person," Garrick said. "I need you to remember that regardless of what the next 20 minutes looks like." The east door blew open. Not explosively, physically pushed, fast, the door swinging wide and hitting the interior wall with the crack of steel on concrete. Two men came through it, and they were not Lehman's uniforms, and they were not Moss's composed conference room presentation. They were Veldon's operational layer, the men below Moss in the hierarchy, the ones who had been in the tunnel maintaining the search pattern, now in the pressing plant's fluorescent light with the specific quality of people who had been given a task and were not interested in conversation about it. Cole hit the first one before he'd taken 3 steps inside. It was not a cinematic collision. It was the brutal, efficient violence of a man who learned to fight in spaces where the point was to end the fight as quickly as possible. A single hard impact that took the man's footing, a follow-through that put him into the pressing equipment along the east wall with enough force to conclude the conversation. The second man had a weapon half-raised and frost was on his arm before it cleared horizontal, and the sound that followed was mechanical and short. And the weapon was on the floor, and the man was against the wall, and Frost had the quality of a man who had done this in worse light. The south access was louder. Garrick went through the south door and Kaylin was running after him before he'd made a conscious decision to run, because the alternative was to stand in the plant with Wrench and his bad knee and the 2 men on the floor and wait for information to arrive secondhand. And Kaylin had learned that waiting for secondhand information was something you did when you had no other option, and right now he had other options. The alley behind the plant was lit by one working streetlight and the headlights of a vehicle that had been driven halfway into the alley mouth and stopped sideways, either as a barricade or because the driver had not anticipated the alley being occupied. Dax and Birch had the south approach in the manner of 2 men who had placed themselves and were not moving, which left the vehicle's occupants with the specific problem of a blocked path and 2 ravens who looked exactly like what they were. Tomas was at the vehicle's driver's side. He had the window down through means that had been rapid and were now irrelevant, and he was talking to the driver with the contained, precise quality of a man delivering information that was not a negotiation. Garrick came into the alley and looked at the scene. The sideways vehicle, Tomas at the window, Dax and Birch holding the mouth, the third vehicle Birch had reported now visible at the far end of the alley as a set of stationary headlights that had not advanced. He looked at all of this, and then he looked at Tomas. "Driver or passenger?" Garrick said. Tomas stepped back from the window. "Driver is contracted. Passenger is not." The passenger door opened. Thomas Aldrin was 61 years old and looked older than that right now. The specific aging that a night of impossible decisions produced in a man who had not made a single correct one of them. He stood in the alley in a suit jacket over a shirt that had been clean that morning and was not anymore. And he looked at Garrick Cade with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation for weeks and understands that the version he rehearsed bears no relationship to the version he is about to have. "Garrick." His voice was wrecked. I need you to know that I didn't know they would. My daughter was in a storm drain for 16 hours, Garrick said. She couldn't breathe. Each sentence its own full stop. You gave them access to my house. I didn't give them. You sat on that board. You voted yes. You let them into your life and you let them into your neighborhood, and when they needed something to hold over me, you were the door they used. Garrick's voice had not risen. It hadn't risen once today, and it wasn't rising now. I don't need you to explain it to me. I need one thing from you. Aldrin looked at him. Veldon has someone at the hospital. I need that neutralized. You have his number. You have the access you gave him. Use it. Aldrin's face went through something complicated and arrived at something simple. He won't listen to me anymore. I'm past useful to him. Then record the call. Call him and tell him Kaylin's statement is being pulled. Tell him whatever you have to tell him to get his people away from that hospital. Garrick stepped closer. And whatever you say on that call goes directly to Obaseki's office. You understand? Aldrin looked at him for a long moment. In the alley light, his face had the quality of a man holding the last useful thing he owned and understanding exactly what spending it would cost. If I do this, Aldrin said, Veldin will know. Yes, Garrick said. He will. The alley was very cold. The distant headlights had not moved. Somewhere above and north, a sound had been building for the last 90 seconds that Kalen had been tracking with the part of his attention that never fully committed to any single focal point. A low, collective, rhythmic sound, building the way weather built, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, the sound of Harley-Davidson engines, not one or two but many, moving through the Foundry District streets in coordinated approach. The Ravens who had stayed at Foundry Road. Repositioned, converging. Aldrin heard it too. He looked up toward the sound, and something in his face changed. The specific change of a man who has been operating in the context of a threat and has just recalculated the dimensions of the forces in play. He took out his phone. He looked at Garrick one last time, and Garrick looked back at him with a face that gave nothing and required everything, and the alley held them both in its cold fluorescent light, while the sound of engines filled the Foundry District like... Thomas Aldrin made the call. He stood in the alley with his phone to his ear and his suit jacket open in the November cold, and he said what Garrick had told him to say. That the statement was being pulled, that the boy was not cooperating, that the Ravens were standing down. His voice shook on the first sentence and steadied on the second. And by the third, it had the flat quality of a man who has crossed a line and understands there is no geometry on the other side of it that leads back. Garrick recorded every word on Tomas's phone. When it was done, Aldrin lowered his own phone and stood in the alley with the particular stillness of a man who has spent the last resource he had and is waiting to find out what that means. He didn't look at Garrick. He looked at the ground between them, at the oil-stained concrete and the cold and the distance, which was not a physical distance, but the specific permanent distance that opens between two people when one of them has used the other's child as currency. Garrick looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Go home. Stay there. When the federal investigators come, and they will come, you tell them everything. Every meeting, every vote, every conversation with Veldin." A pause. "All of it?" Aldrin looked up. "They'll prosecute." "Yes, Garrick said. "They will." The silence that followed was not forgiveness and was not its absence. It was something more complicated than either. The acknowledgement of a man who has been wronged, extending the minimum necessary to the man who wronged him in service of a purpose larger than the wrong. Aldrin nodded once, the smallest possible motion, and got back into the vehicle, and the vehicle reversed out of the alley mouth and was gone. Tomas was already sending the recording. Veldin's people left the hospital at 2:47 a.m. Petra confirmed it through a contact at Duskfield General's security desk. Two men who had been positioned in the waiting area for 3 hours, listed on the visitor log as family of another patient, walking out together with the coordinated unhurriedness of a professional withdrawal. They did not run. They did not make a scene. They simply ceased to be present, which was itself a kind of answer to the question of whether Aldrin's call had worked. Juno sent a single text to Garrick's phone. "She's sleeping. Oxygen sat 97. Color is good." Garrick read it standing outside the pressing plant in the Foundry District cold, the sounds of engines having faded now to the ordinary nighttime sounds of the city, and he stood there with the phone in both hands and read it again, and did not say anything, and did not need to. Kalen, standing nearby with his wet boots and his Carhartt jacket and his cracked screen phone at 4% battery now, watched him read it and thought about what it cost to hold something that tightly for that long and then receive confirmation that the thing was still intact. He didn't have a complete framework for it. He thought he was starting to build one. 9. The federal complaint reached the Oversight Committee's emergency intake at 3:19 a.m., filed under Deirdre Obaseki's signature with 47 supporting documents attached. Kalen's statement went with it, typed by Petra from his verbal account, verified line by line, signed with his full name and the Archer Street shelter as his address of record. He had signed it without ceremony, in a folding chair in the pressing plant, under fluorescent lights, with a pen wrench produced from his jacket pocket. Wrench had looked at the signed document for a moment before Petra scanned it. "You know this puts your name on a federal record," he said. "I know," Kalen said. "Veldon's lawyers will try to depose you." "I know that too." Wrench had looked at him with the expression he used when something confirmed a prior assessment. He took the document back without further comment, which from Wrench was a complete sentence. Detective Lehman was placed on administrative suspension at 6:40 a.m., pending investigation into his conduct during the Marlowe Cade case. The suspension was voluntary in the technical sense that all things done under sufficient institutional pressure are voluntary. The two officers who had been stationed outside Raven Forge were reassigned. Nobody made a public statement about any of it, which was how these things initially moved. Quietly, in the bureaucratic language of reassignment and pending review, the system correcting without acknowledging that correction was required. Rourke Veldon was placed under federal investigation by noon. His name appeared in no press releases. His assets were frozen through a subsidiary structure that took the investigators the better part of a day to fully map. He was not arrested that day because men like Veldon were not arrested the same day. They were arrested after the architecture of their position had been methodically disassembled, layer by layer, and Kalen understood this and understood that understanding it was not the same as accepting it easily. He said as much to Garrick 2 days later, and Garrick had said, "I know, keep going anyway," which was not a satisfying answer and was also the only true one. Duskfield General's pediatric ward smelled like antiseptic, and the specific artificial warmth of climate-controlled institutional space, and in the late afternoon of the second day it also smelled like the coffee Garrick had been bringing in a thermos from Raven Forge, and the crayons Marlowe had requested, which were being used on the large format paper the nurses had found and taped to the wall beside her bed. She was drawing the tunnel, not traumatically, with the focused concentration of a child processing experience through the available medium, the way children had always processed things that were too large for words. The tunnel was dark blue crayon, and the water was lighter blue, and the people in it were stick figures of varying heights, and one of them had red scribbled hair, and one was very tall, and one had a bag, and one was smaller than the others. Marlowe looked at the small figure for a moment. Then she held the crayon out toward Kalen, who was sitting on the chair beside the bed that had been pulled close at some point in the past 2 days and had not been moved back. "You need red hair too," she said. Kalen looked at the crayon. "I don't have red hair." "You do in my drawing." She was matter-of-fact about this in the way that 8-year-olds were matter-of-fact about creative decisions. "You can do it yourself, or I can do it." He took the crayon and made a small scribble of red above the small stick figure's head, which satisfied her, and she took the crayon back and added what appeared to be a fox standing beside the small figure, orange with one eye, because the fox in the drawing had both its eyes and the real fox had only one, and Marlowe had apparently decided the drawing version deserved the better deal. The stuffed fox was on the bed beside her. It had been cleaned. One of the nurses had done it without being asked, had returned it dried and slightly fluffier than before, and Marlowe had received it with the specific solemnity of an 8-year-old receiving something that mattered enormously, and was trying not to perform that enormity too openly, which was a quality Kalen recognized from the inside. Garrick was in the doorway. He'd been there for a few minutes, watching, and Kalen had known he was there without turning around in the particular way you developed awareness of people who occupied space with that quality of steadiness. "Deb called," Garrick said. Kalen looked at him then. Deb, his case manager at Archer Street, the one who remembered his name. "She said your bed is held. She wanted you to know." Kalen nodded, looked back at the drawing. "Okay." A pause. The quality of a man choosing words with the same care he'd chosen everything else today. "There's a room above the shop," Garrick said, "above Raven Forge. It was a storage room, but Wrench cleared it out 2 weeks ago for reasons nobody asked him about, because he does things before they're needed and then doesn't explain them." He paused. "It has a window, a bed, a heater that works if you hit the side panel." Another pause. "There's a high school 4 blocks from Foundry Road. Tomas already checked. They have open enrollment through December." Kalen was looking at the wall, at the drawing, at the small stick figure with its red scribble of hair that wasn't accurate and was somehow more accurate than accuracy would have been. "That's a lot of information," he said. "It is," Garrick said. The room was quiet except for the marker sounds Marlowe was making, extending the drawing now, adding a surface above the tunnel, a city skyline in very approximate crayon, a sun in the corner the way children put suns in corners. "I'm not a project," Kalen said. He said it without aggression, as a statement of what was true, offered plainly, for calibration. "I know that," Garrick said. "I'm not a debt either. You don't owe me anything for the backpack." "I know that too." Kalen looked at him. Garrick looked back with the same uncomplicated directness he'd had from the moment he'd turned around in Ravenforge and seen a mud-covered teenager holding his daughter's backpack and had not asked him to leave or handed him to a uniform or made him feel like a complication. The same directness he'd had in the tunnel and the alley and every interval between. "Then what is it?" Kalen said. Garrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's a room above a shop, and a heater that works if you hit it right. And people who won't lose track of you." He paused. "That's all it is." Marlowe had added, in green crayon in the upper corner of the drawing, what appeared to be a motorcycle. It was not an accurate motorcycle. It had 4 wheels and what might have been flames coming from the back, or might have been hair. She was satisfied with it. Kalen looked at the drawing, at the sun in the corner and the tunnel in blue and the small red-haired stick figure standing beside a one-eyed fox. "Okay," he said. The Harleys rolled out of Duskfield at dawn on the 4th day. Not all of them, not a departure, just the particular morning roll that the Steel Ravens did when the city had settled back into something manageable and the air was cold enough to make the engines speak differently, with the deep, resonant note that cold mornings drew from them. Garrick at the front. Tomas behind him, Cole and Dax and Frost and Wrench, his bad knee accommodated by a bike adjustment nobody had commented on, and the others in the loose formation that wasn't a formation because formations were for organizations that needed display, and the Ravens had never needed display. Kalen stood outside Raven Forge and watched them go. He had a key in his pocket, a simple key, brass on a plain ring that Wrench had handed him the previous evening without ceremony and without eye contact, in the way Wrench did everything that mattered, sideways and efficient, and declining to make more of it than it was. The sound of the engines carried for a long time in the cold morning air, long after the bikes had turned east and disappeared behind the industrial skyline. Duskfield was waking up around it. The ordinary sounds of a city morning, a garbage truck 2 streets over, a bus making its stop on Foundry Road, a dog barking once and then going quiet. The city had not changed. The kickback structures and the institutional failures and the Lehmans of the world were still there, reassigned and pending and slowly grinding through the mechanisms that would determine whether the grinding produced anything. Veldon's lawyers were already working. The federal process would take the time it took, which was longer than felt right and shorter than nothing. None of this was resolution in the clean sense. Resolution. In the clean sense was a thing that happened in drawings, in the corner with the sun and the approximate motorcycle. But Marlowe was breathing at 97% and drawing tunnels in blue crayon. And Deirdre Obaseki had 47 documents and a federal complaint number and a phone that had been ringing for 2 days with reporters who had been sitting on the petro-supplied embargo and were now not sitting on anything. And Thomas Aldrin had gone home and stayed there, as told, and federal investigators had knocked on his door at 9 a.m. the previous morning, as predicted, and he had opened it. And Kalen Voss had a key in his pocket and a room with a window and a heater that worked if you hit it right, and 4 blocks from here there was a school with open enrollment through December. He stood in the cold until the last sound of the engines faded into the ordinary noise of the morning, and then he put his hand around the key, and he went inside.